Free Palestine!
Muhammad Abdullah Fayed, Muhammad Ali Muhammad Nusayr.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The unprecedented disgust over Israeli killings of Palestinians has led to something unprecedented in Connecticut. Multiple rallies in many cities in the state, all within the same week or two. We've covered the rallies in New Haven, New London, Hartford, and Manchester. Later in the program, we'll show video from Waterbury. But first, video of the rally in Stamford, Connecticut, held by a number of Islamic organizations for Palestine.
Inshallah. Meetings at your Islamic Community Center in Bridgeport there, back when Ibrahim was the president. Yes. Sure. Yeah. He would like to meet you, inshallah. Okay. Megaphone. Wallahi, see.
Free Palestine! Free Al-Aqsa Mosque!
Free Palestine! 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 From the ocean to the sea. Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Never die! Gaza, don't cry! Gaza, don't cry! Palestine will never die! Palestine will never die! Killing children is a crime! 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 5, 6, 7, 8. crime. Killing children is a crime. Killing children is a crime. Killing children is a crime. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. Killing children is a crime. Killing children is a crime. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. Killing children is a crime. Killing children is a crime.
Killing children is a crime.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Killing children is a crime.
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 Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Killing children is a crime.
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 Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine.
Palestine will never die!
Palestine will never die!
Rasulullah!
Shame on you!
Before we go to Waterbury, I want to talk about this letter signed by over 100 Jews calling for the taking down of the Israeli flag from all Jewish communal spaces. You may not know it, but it's routine for the Israeli flag to be displayed in synagogues and in Jewish Federation offices. Well, 100 of us are so repulsed about what Israel has been doing that we're calling for the taking down of that flag. Israel is an apartheid society. Its government is therefore legally engaged in an ongoing criminal enterprise. In the statement, we compare the Israeli flag to the Confederate flag, which now almost universally is considered a racist disgrace. We have an impressive group of signers, but we're looking for many more. To find out about this in more depth, go to the website, thestruggle.org. Now to Waterbury.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you so much for showing your support, your time, and your dedication to the fight for Palestine, for the Palestinian people fighting for their lives over there, and for giving them hope while they constantly face an oppressor trying to take them down every single day. Today, we'll be having a vigil for the lives that we have lost, but not forgotten, from Gaza and the West Bank.
The event, in part, was a vigil. The young people read the names, one by one, of all the Palestinians killed in Gaza and the West Bank.
So first we're going to start with the martyrs from the West Bank. Abdullah Khalid Dabas, Muhammad Ayman Fathi, now from Gaza, Muhammad Abdullah Fayed, Muhammad Ali Muhammad Nusir,
Ismat Shaban Al-Zain, Zakaria Ziad Aloush,
رائد العبد أبو وردة نبيل نعمان دردونة.
And it went on from there as hundreds of names were read and hundreds of candles lit in the still bright early evening.
And now we're going to have Basla Munir talk about the financial situation, the Ruger guns.
The Biden administration recently recently has approved an arms sale of $735 million of precision-guided weapons to Israel. That's $735 million arms sale, which is intended to be used against the Palestinian people, including the innocent children, who don't have a military, they don't have weapons, and the United States is aiding the Israeli apartheid regime with your tax dollars. Is that what you want? No! The U.S. has already given more than $3.8 billion to aid in Israel. While President Joe Biden tries to say that Israel has a right to self-defense, killing children in the street is not self-defense. And what about the right of self-defense for the Palestinians? Why is no one talking about that? Israel has blatantly violated the basic human rights of the Palestinian people for the past 70 years. And with the U.S. financially aiding Israel, we're complicit for every death, displacement, and disenfranchisement of the millions of Palestinian people. We have to stop the ongoing flow of weapons to the Israeli government. We have witnessed the Israeli government's violent and apartheid policies and in an attempt to displace Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. We must not continue rewarding the Israeli government with a blank check in military funding and a constant flow of weapons. Even after a so-called ceasefire was called, we saw IDF soldiers once again attack Palestinian worshippers in their place of worship at the Al-Aqsa Mosque with stun grenades and rubber bullets. This is once again Israel abusing its power and brutalizing the Palestinian people, completely disregarding their humanity. Not to mention, Connecticut itself is complicit with the Ruger rifles that are sent to Israel and have killed innocent Palestinians like Ali Abu Alia on his 15th birthday. That's just one out of hundreds that have been killed by a rifle that is given right here in Connecticut to Israel. We don't want our state to be complicit. That's blood on our hands, and we must stop rewarding Israel for its war crimes against Palestinians with billions of dollars, and we have to outwardly condemn the actions of Israel. We cannot stand idly while our brothers and sisters in Palestine are dying on the street. You have to continue to speak out and fight, because we know that the time is coming when we will finally see a free and liberated Palestine. Okay, so next up we have Jannah Rabah, and she will be speaking about Gaza as someone who is originally from there.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. As a daughter of Palestinian refugees from Gaza, I wanted to speak to you about my trips to Gaza as a child and how the policies Basila and Hala were talking about, they're real and they impact real people. The last time I visited Gaza was in the summer of 2013. After a long flight to Cairo, a 5-hour journey in the Egyptian desert, in a broken down car without AC, I finally reached Gaza. This 4-day-long journey was precisely what it took to reach Gaza. Gaza's only airport was once a beacon of hope for Palestinians, but it had a short 2-year run, eventually being obliterated by a series of Israeli airstrikes, making it much more difficult to see my family. My father himself has not been to Gaza in 16 years. He lost both parents, siblings, childhood friends, all from watching afar. On top of the isolation, the 15-year blockade on Gaza has shattered the economy, stolen every opportunity for prosperity. Having a college degree virtually carries no weight. Cousins who are nurses and engineers spend decades without any work. Out of 11 cousins who have a college education, only 2 of them have a job. As the blockade persisted, unemployment rates rose from 40 to 43.1%, some of the highest rates in the world. In search of work, 2 of my cousins, along with other Gazans, fled to Belgium and Greece. One left home without telling his family. He wanted to spare them from the thoughts of the boat capsizing. During that same visit, we spent days sitting around in the scorching heat while our bodies were coated in sweat. In order to shower, we'd painstakingly wait to heat up a pot of water for every person on a gas stove. And on top of all that, trying to balance a flashlight in the dark. In Gaza, there is only power 5 hours in the day. Under these conditions, the simplest tasks become incredibly difficult every single day. Not only is it frequent bombing campaigns, but it's the brutal and dreadful reality that they live under. After years of not seeing my grandmother, Sifti Allah Yarhamha, I heard her last wails of pain on the telephone. She suffered tremendous pain and wasn't given the critical care she needed after slipping on the kitchen floor and breaking her hip. She spent her final years in despair and perpetual pain. Gaza lacks hospital beds, medical supplies, and technology essential for adequate medical care that would prolong my grandmother's life, along with so many Gazans. Their healthcare system is in tatters after a COVID crisis and frequent Israeli airstrikes. This past campaign destroyed 19 healthcare facilities. 19 healthcare facilities. And so many healthcare workers died. This chokehold on their right to live won't stop Palestinians from fighting for liberation. There is resilience amongst the despair, the same resilience that powered 73 years of revolution and restlessness. Their temperamental borders and chokehold on Gaza necks is exactly why my mother tongue isn't sharp, but my voice for advocacy is loud and clear. May we one day see a free Palestine within our lifetime, and may God rest the souls of all those who died.
Israeli killings are unfortunately not a thing of the past. On June 11th, as we record, a 16-year-old youth, Mohammed Saeed Mohammed Hamayel, was shot to death in a West Bank town. A report was released today by Amnesty International about the terrible abuse inflicted by the Chinese government on its Uyghur Muslim citizens. It begins since 2017, under the guise of a campaign against terrorism, the government of China has carried out massive and systematic abuses against Muslims living in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Far from a legitimate response to the purported terrorist threat, the government's campaign evinces a clear intent to target parts of Xinjiang's population collectively on the basis of religion and ethnicity, and to use severe violence and intimidation to root out Islamic religious beliefs. The illustrations for the report were all done by the famed artist Molly Crabapple. We'll link to the Amnesty report at thestruggle.org. Last week we had portions of Linda Kikovich's talk at the RPM event, Despots Don't Belong in Left Spaces. This week we'll see part of the talk of Michael Karadjis. Karadjis is an Australian and teaches social science at the University of Western Sydney University and has a long history himself in left activism.
About this split between socialism from above and socialism from below, these two perspectives. And so where did this start? Well, there's different perspectives on how far this went back, on how far this goes back. I mean, from one perspective, this goes back to this goes back to the split after the Russian Revolution between Stalinism and anti-Stalinism, so that, okay, we had those supporting a Stalinist perspective, that defending every action of the Stalin regime in the Soviet Union, all the horrendous repression, the great purges, and so on in the Soviet Union and other so-called socialist countries, while opponents of that whether Trotskyists or anarchists and anarcho-communists and libertarian socialists and, you know, whatever they were called, condemning these regimes as violating the most elementary principles of socialism, because the most elementary principle of socialism is, of course, power of the working class, understood to mean the vast majority of the population. Stalinists defended these regimes from the point of view that perhaps they're not perfect, but they are socialist in their economies. They've got full employment, free healthcare and education, and so on. And that, yes, maybe there's some things wrong, but that's simply because of the era we're living in, and because they're surrounded by capitalist countries putting pressure on them and so on. Now, this viewpoint was wrong even at the time, but perhaps we can understand where it was coming from back in the 1930s. The West was in its Great Depression, and while Stalin was carrying out this horrendous, frightful repression, this was decades before the internet, or even decades before mass media, mass TV viewing, and so on. And so, wanting to believe in a better society, it was probably easy for a lot of people to believe that all the stories about repression in the Soviet Union were just propaganda. Therefore, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East Bloc, this kind of Stalinist left had nothing. Everything was gone. So they transferred the same method, this method of slavishly giving apologetics for dictatorships. They transferred that now to any dictatorship that supposedly had some kind of conflict with US imperialism. No matter how real, or in the cases of, say, Milosevic and Assad, purely imaginary, right? Regardless of the fact that these regimes had nothing to do with socialism, they were simply dictatorships or repressive regimes based on the rule of big capital. So if we can say that before 1990, this kind of thinking was at least theoretically connected to some idea of a connection to a better society, no matter how mistaken, after 1990, there's no connection whatsoever. Essentially, this form of leftism is defending regimes which are often fascist-like in their nature and in their actions. In addition, as this was already decades after the advent of mass media and now fully into the age of the internet, the excuse of not knowing, of claiming it's all Western propaganda no longer holds. I mean, like in Syria, for example, I mean, thousands of people have, made direct film footage, this direct accounts from, thousands of Syrians themselves, from refugees, from there's film footage of, people in protests and being gunned down and so on. I mean, this is not, you can't say this is all propaganda and claim you don't know what's going on. They know full well what these anti-working class dictatorships are doing, yet still go out of their way to defend them. But while this might be a continuation in some senses, from another perspective, this is an entirely new thing. And the interesting thing is, it's not simply the old traditional Stalinist groups that have transferred from one to the other. It's even a lot of other leftists that didn't have a traditional connection to being slavish followers of the Soviet leadership or the Chinese leadership. There's even a lot of new leftists that are coming out and supporting this kind of politics, having no connection to socialism or to the working class, even theoretically, but only a disemboweled so-called anti-imperialism with no content whatsoever. Can also be seen as an entirely new development in the post-Cold War world. We'll probably discuss this anti-imperialism more a little bit later, but just to say that this was a new ideology in the way it was put forward, I think. In the past, anti-imperialism at least had some connection to anti-capitalism. And which is what Linda talked about, and I agree with the perspective she's put forward here. And it was related to the fact that peoples of the global south were and are oppressed and exploited by global imperialism. In its new rendition, let's go to the 1990s, when this became very obvious. The people like the Bosnian Muslims and the mixed Bosnian populations in the big cities like Sarajevo, in the 1990s, they were simply resisting a massive military onslaught by heavily armed Serbian nationalism. Heavily armed because the Serbian Republic within the old Yugoslav Federation inherited all the weaponry from former Yugoslavia, which didn't all belong to one of its republics, but that was Belgrade, so they inherited it. They were able to throw all these massive weaponry of the ex-Yugoslav army against the completely unarmed Bosnian Republic and unarmed cities, and by simply defending their cities, by simply trying to save their lives, to protect themselves from an actually declared attempt at destroying them as a people, that is attempted genocide, they now became slandered as agents of imperialism for defending their lives. While those leading the genocidal onslaught were deemed as anti-imperialist fighters. Now, how or why could this development take place? Mostly it was due to nothing other than a lot of verbal condemnation of the Serbian onslaught by the West. Why was the West engaged in verbal onslaught against Serbia? Well, given the level of massive instability this was creating right in the heart of Europe, in the heart of the new European Union and all the rest of it, with millions of refugees being created, more than half the population of Bosnia uprooted, and the expressed concerns of European leaders that if there was no kind of compromise, the Bosnian Muslims would become a Gaza in Europe. Yes, they did feel the need to condemn. And yet, despite these concerns, neither the European Union nor the US did anything to aid the so-called imperialist-backed Bosnians. And by the way, let's just can that myth right now that there was intervention in Bosnia. There wasn't. There was intervention at the end of the Bosnian War, which gave the Serbian Republic 50% of Bosnia. That was an intervention just to seal the deal. Let's be very clear. In fact, right through the 3.5 years of the war, the main action of the West, of the US and the European Union, was to enforce with their navies in the Adriatic Sea, to enforce an arms embargo on the Bosnian Republic, on the besieged Bosnian Republic. And the onslaught by right-wing nationalism was led by Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic, who was the very leader who had led the overthrow of actually existing socialism, the Tito model in Yugoslavia. The ideology of Serbian nationalism was the antithesis of the former Yugoslavia's ideology of brotherhood and unity. However real that was the ideology, because it aimed to keep a multinational federation together. So it always tried to dampen down the nationalism of powerful republics like Serbia or Croatia. And Milosevic, of course, was surrounded, like Assad today, surrounded by cronies who were the new mega capitalist class of this new Serbia. You can name them. This one was head of the private telecommunications company, and so on and so on. So what content was there? There wasn't even a theoretical content of supporting a regime like this, let alone these kinds of actions, which would normally be called racist, ultranationalist, and in practice genocidal, let alone condemning the people defending themselves as being agents of imperialism for defending themselves. and thus an anti-imperialism that turns traditional notions of leftist solidarity with the oppressed on its head. This is what we've seen again in the last decade with Syria. In fact, it's actually all deja vu, as well as there being lots of other cases and examples in between. And it's interesting that we've just seen now Grey Zone, one of the leaders of this sort of so-called anti-imperialist kind of thinking, now coming out in support of the Burmese junta as it mows down protesters with using all the same kind of reason, all the same sort of rationale. I'll just leave it there for now.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.